The Artemis Accords are, it's a document that is a non-binding agreement. So it's not a treaty. It doesn't create any international law. Originally, the United States, NASA, brought out the Artemis Accords as a series of principles so that any country or commercial entity that was going to be part of the Artemis program to return to the moon, to return humans to the moon and to create a new lunar program, that they would agree to those principles so that there could be some general operating agreements and principles in place. But since the Artemis Accords were first released in 2020, I think we're up to 28 countries now that have signed them, and they're not necessarily all going to be part of the Artemis program. So it's no longer just a document for those who are part of that program. It's kind of become a document to express shared values or principles and to try to fill in the gap around certain parts of international space law. So the question whether or not we need them is a bit contentious. We need something because there is a bit of a gap, particularly if we're looking at whether or not mining natural resources in space is lawful under the original 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And if it is, how it's going to be governed. We definitely have a gap around that in international space law and international space governance. But whether or not we need a document that was drafted by one country based on its own interests in these activities, that's a little bit contentious. So the Artemis Accords are made up of a bunch of principle statements, and some of them are not at all contentious and very sensible. And two of those include interoperability. So it's kind of like we want to make sure we don't have problems between Mac and PC when we're working with very different commercial entities and countries from around the world. We need to make sure that the technologies being developed are interoperable, that they literally can plug into each other when it's hardware, and that they can communicate with each other when it's software. So that's a very sensible principle to put in place when we're dealing with a lot of new and untested technologies. Another principle which I think a lot of people see as being a sensible one, though it's also contentious, is the idea of safety zones. So the Outer Space Treaty says that there is no sovereignty in outer space. No country and no commercial entity, no individual can claim ownership, for example, of the moon. But if a certain country or commercial entity has landed its equipment in a certain place and it wants to start prospecting or doing scientific investigations or even start mining for resources, there has to be some kind of agreement about how close others can come to that equipment and to that site. And so the Artemis Accords suggest that we should have safety zones. Now, this is, again, a little bit contentious because although it may not be claiming ownership of that bit of real estate, effectively what it says is if I'm here, you can't come here. And so it's denying your ability to access that part of the moon or that celestial body, the asteroid, whatever it may be. And it's also contentious if we start to think about the potential of extending this to safety zones around satellites or spacecraft, because again, we cannot claim ownership of a particular orbital slot or a particular place around the moon or around the Earth. But there are some orbital slots which are very commercially or militarily important. And if we start to declare safety zones around spacecraft or satellites, we're also going to see a little bit of a real estate grab that's a bit of a proxy for not being able to claim ownership, but still being able to deny access to others of something that might be a very interesting or important bit of real estate in space. So there are 5 core space treaties, which are binding treaties. And treaties work a little bit like contracts. When countries sign on to them, they are bound with respect to each other. The 5th of those 5 core space treaties is called the Moon Agreement, the 1979 Moon Agreement. And it was set up because countries could see the potential in the future of some countries or even commercial entities being able to mine for resources in space. So obviously that wasn't happening in 1979, but they could see the potential for it. It was driven very much by a group of non-aligned countries. So countries that were neither in the 1970s aligning themselves with the US and the West, nor with the Soviets and the communist bloc. But they were really trying to push for the rights that are set down in the first of the 5 core space treaties, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which says every every country has a right of access to and use of space without regard to their economic status or their technological development. And so the Moon Agreement was, for the most part, these non-aligned countries saying, at such a time as we think space mining is about to become feasible, we want to see an international regulatory regime put in place. The Moon Agreement also says very clearly, no country and no entity can own any part of the moon. So it tries to clarify what's a little bit of a grey area in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which says no national sovereignty, but we don't really know what that means if it comes to extracting resources. So it tries to close that gap. The problem is not many countries signed onto it, and none of the major spacefaring states did or have done since. So we have countries like India is a signatory, but it has never ratified it. That means at the time it indicated its desire to be bound by this treaty, but it's never taken the steps under domestic Indian law to make sure that it actually becomes a binding treaty to India. So it's in this kind of limbo status, and it's been in that limbo status for such a long time that it may be that Modi or some future government may decide, yes, suddenly it wants to ratify this treaty, but it's probably unlikely, and other countries like France are in a similar position. But Australia has signed and ratified it and is therefore bound by it. Australia is the only country in the world today that has signed and ratified both the Moon Agreement and the Artemis Accords. Up until the beginning of 2023, Saudi Arabia was also in that position, but very soon after it signed the Artemis Accords, it said it's withdrawing from the Moon Agreement. Now, why is that? That's because, as I said, the Moon Agreement says very clearly no entity can own any part of the moon, and the countries that have signed the Moon Agreement are bound, obliged under international law at such a time as that technology is about to become feasible to establish an international regime to govern it. Whereas the Artemis Accords say very clearly, no, any state that signs the Artemis Accords declares that it believes that space mining is lawful under the Outer Space Treaty, and we don't need anything else to govern it, other than perhaps these principles that are about shared values. And so really you have two documents that disagree with each other. So Saudi Arabia decided after signing the Artemis Accords that it couldn't remain a party to the Moon Agreement, and it withdrew its signature. That doesn't happen very often in international law. Most countries, when they sign up to a treaty, that's a binding indication, regardless if there's a change of government or values over time. It's a very rare thing that a country will withdraw from a treaty. Australia has decided, it's determined that it can interpret both the Moon Agreement and the Artemis Accords as being in harmony with each other. That's the official government stance. But there's no real clarity as to how it reads the two in harmony with each other. It's actually in a little bit of I once described it as being between a moon rock and a hard place, right? So it's stuck between two obligations, and it really has to figure out what it's going to do about its obligation to come up with an international governing regime when it's also signed this agreement with the US and other countries saying, no, we think space mining is fine. So we have to figure out as a country what we're going to do, whether we're going to see that as an opportunity to perhaps take some leadership in and advancing what that governing regime looks like. India doesn't have the same obligation under the Moon Agreement because it's never ratified it, but it may need to take a bit of a clear stance as to what it believes its status is with respect to the Moon Agreement, whether it's going to take the step of ratification, whether it might remove its signature, whether it maybe will just need to make some kind of international unilateral declaration stating what it believes its obligations are. And I think a lot of eyes are going to be on India right now because of the successful moon landing very recently, which is an amazing achievement, particularly because India's done that in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost of the traditional leading space powers. And so it really is in a very interesting place in terms of international space governance. The steps that India decides to take and where it decides to side in terms of governance of these future activities is actually going to be very influential for what other countries might decide as well. So mini-lateral or multilateral, I guess we need to clarify what we mean by that. Multilateral usually means a treaty. So states come together, usually under the auspices of the United Nations, They negotiate over time, right down to exact words and commas and full stops, because the way that a sentence is phrased in a treaty, much like in a contract, is very, very important in terms of interpretation. The challenge of multilateral treaty making is that it has to be based on consensus. And when you negotiate down to commas and full stops and exact wording, what you end up with is a lowest common denominator, because there might be different political interests. And if we're thinking about space mining in particular, where there are different interpretations globally around whether or not space mining is lawful under the Outer Space Treaty, if it is lawful, do we have an obligation to share the benefits of those activities? Because there's very much language around that in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Some countries assert that there is an obligation to set up a benefit sharing regime, a bit like the International Seabed Authority. Other countries have made very clear they want no part in an obligatory system of benefit sharing. The US has made that absolutely clear. It also doesn't participate in the International Seabed Authority, and it's made consistent statements at every international multilateral forum where it's relevant that it wants no part in a benefit sharing regime. So politically, there's a little bit of contention around what to do around that. And so multilateral treaty making is probably not going to be our answer when it comes to governing space mining or governing other future activities, lunar activities in particular. There are some other multilateral projects or processes underway. For instance, at the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, there is a working group focused very much on how should we govern exploitation and extraction and use of space resources. That doesn't necessarily have to lead to a draft treaty. It could also lead to soft law. And when we say soft law, what we usually mean is clear documents that are articulating guidelines or shared principles. And we have a few examples of those, for instance, around space debris. We have the 2007 Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, and we also have the 2019 Long-Term Sustainability Guidelines. Both of those have come out of UN processes. They are very much consensus-based in terms of the drafting, but they're not binding. They call on states to take responsible actions and to implement things at the domestic level, but there's no legal obligation in them. But that can still be a very effective political tool. There's a very effective way to kind of politically shame those who are not implementing these guidelines, or there's a bit of a positive competition happening at the UN that was led in the first place by the UK and by other middle powers to say, well, we are taking the lead at implementing these long-term sustainability guidelines. We are being sustainable and responsible actors. And we're starting to see that emerging a little bit around space arms control as well. For instance, a lot of countries saying we're never going to test debris creating anti-satellite weapons, and other countries saying, well, this is an emerging norm, so not binding, but a strong political norm. So soft law can still be effective. And then we have mini-lateral, which is when you have a smaller group of nations coming together. And that, again, can sometimes lead to treaties which are bilateral or just for a group of nations. You see that around trade treaties, for instance, or agreements around fishing and maritime zones, if you have a group of nations that have shared maritime boundaries. Or it could be around security agreements. And we see that, for instance, with the quadrilateral dialogue, so India, Japan, US and Australia. And so that has not come up with treaties, but it's very much a place in which those 4 countries can come and discuss issues of importance. They did that around COVID, they're doing that around security agreements. And I would very much like to see space and space governance much more on the agenda in the quadrilateral dialogue, because those mini-lateral kind of roundtables, that it's very high level. It's where we see heads of state and ministers of foreign and defence affairs and trade affairs can very quickly come up with agreements and shared values. And I would love to see space governance become something more that we see the Quad doing together. And I guess you could say the Artemis Accords started out as a bit of a mini-lateral initiative. So drafted by the US, they brought in a few other countries, and then there were 7 nations that signed it in the first place and said these accords now exist. But as we've seen more and more countries sign on to it, and they've been doing so unilaterally, they've simply said, we're signing it as well. Sometimes they have a signing ceremony to make it look official, but it's no longer something that has to do with a specific relationship with the US or NASA or the Artemis program. So whether or not we can say it's mini-lateral, I'm not really sure, especially given that any countries that sign on to it now, including India fairly recently, they have not had a part in drafting what those principles are. So it's a symbolic thing to say we're signing on to it, but that's not quite the same as mini-lateral groups coming together and really developing and agreeing to what their shared values or principles or activities will be. So I guess the short answer to all of that is we need a bit of everything. Treaties are very slow, and I think at the moment we're not going to see new space law treaties emerge in the next few years, perhaps in the next decade or so, another one. But what we're going to see much more of is mini-lateral, bilateral agreements around cooperation for, especially for peaceful activities in outer space and scientific, preventing armed conflict in outer space. We're going to see more and more soft law emerging through multilateral processes like the open-ended working group on reducing space threats and like the working group in COPUOS that's focusing on resource exploitation. So we're going to see more and more soft law and initiatives to try and really develop agreed guidelines. And we need also to have commercial entities involved in those processes and civil society. So academic experts, those with shared interests being able to feed into those processes so that they're not purely determined by political interests. I take a little bit of a controversial position with respect to the Artemis Accords, and I wish people would ask more often what were the driving interests of the state who started the process and the states who were the first to sign it. Because what we've seen is very much this gap in international space law that needs to be filled. But when that is filled by the unilateral interests of one of the strongest powers that we have geopolitically, at a time when there is a new race on to return to the moon, because this is about resources. It's about finding the best place for ice so that we can use water and other gases so that we can create fuel, so that we can have long-term human habitation, be able to have space stations orbiting the moon. And this is all going to become commercially, politically, and potentially militarily very contentious. It's a new competition. So when the US released the Artemis Accords, I took a very critical position with respect to that, in particular because of the principles that say space mining is lawful and it's going to happen. Safety zones are not just a practical thing, but also have this effect of creating a bit of a real estate grab. When it is the US asserting its interpretation of international space law and saying, in the beginning, if you want to be part of NASA's program to return to the moon, which a lot of smaller nations want to, you have to agree with our interpretation of international space law. So it kind of forced the hand of countries. You could say they have a choice, but it was a very limited political choice to say, we agree with the US interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty, when that was not necessarily the position of all of those countries which have since signed the Artemis Accords. So it was political. It has also started off very rapidly a process that looks like we might have more and more countries expressing what's called opinio juris, their legal opinion about their obligations under international law with respect to the legality of space mining. And I think it's concerning when that comes out of other political power plays, and given that we're seeing something that is very different from the 20th century space race, but it has some similarities in the sense that countries and commercial entities which start to win major steps in this race, that's going to solidify their position geopolitically as well, in a linear economy, but also with what's happening politically and militarily. And that is what happened with the 20th century space race. When it was between the Soviets and the US, it was all about demonstrating the technological prowess of their ideological political competition. And that is what we are seeing. It's just that today we have many more countries involved in commercial entities, but that's what our geopolitics look like. So I was concerned about the process, particularly when smaller countries don't have other opportunities, and those who have signed on later did not have opportunities to contribute to designing those principles. I've spoken at length with particularly individuals who drafted them. I have a lot of respect for Gabe Swiney, who was the US State Department attorney who was very much one of the lead authors of the Artemis Accords. And I have an enormous respect for the work he does and for him as a person. And he's absolutely convinced from his perspective within his role within the US, they were doing a good thing to fill a gap in international space law. And based on shared values and purposes, and this is all a good thing. But if that were Russia doing that in the first place, or China, they would be highly, highly critical of it. So it's understandable that Russia and China and some other countries and smaller non-aligned nations have also been very critical of this highly political process. So those are the kinds of questions that I wish people would ask more often. Yes, we need some kind of governing regime. Yes, it's going to be filled by those countries and entities that fill the vacuum quickest, but we really need to keep in mind the other interests that go with that and who is excluded from and included in those processes. Look, there's a lot of literature emerging around how we interpret international space law. There's actually not very much around the Artemis Accords. So I think there are some very short commentaries worth looking at. There was one written by a couple of students at the McGill Institute of Air and Space Law that is called Moon Agreement, Hanging by a Thread, ? By Stefan Michael Wedenick and Jack Wright Nelson. So that's something that people can just Google. I think that's a very useful commentary. But really, I think if we're looking at long-term, the challenges of how we govern these emerging activities and the fact that it's not just countries with many, many more countries than it used to be, but it's also commercial entities that are integral to what's happening. I think there is one piece of science fiction that I have found quite useful, which was a mockumentary series put out by National Geographic several years ago, and it's simply called Mars. And what they did was they interviewed, part of it is documentary, they've interviewed people at NASA, at the Japanese space agency, JAXA. They've interviewed engineers and astronauts. They interviewed Elon Musk from his commercial perspective. They've interviewed experts around international competition and conflict and around oceans governance. And they took all of these interviews and highlighted what are the challenges we're going to be faced with as humans go off-world. And as we do so as a political and technological and commercial competition, how's that going to pan out? What are the physical and technological challenges, but also the political and economic ones? And then they use those interviews and they have a parallel future drama series that plays out a fictional series based on what these experts are saying is likely to happen. So I found that a really great way of imagining what it's going to look like based on insights that we have today. And I think that's a really useful resource, is to be thinking through the eyes of fiction, but based on what we know historically and present day our challenges to be.